Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of How to Live to 200, where we focus on the science and practice of health, human performance, and longevity. On today's episode, I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Will Cole, who practices functional medicine and is the author of the book Ketotarian. That's right, Dr. Cole advocates for a completely plant-based keto diet, which, like many of you, I thought sounded paradoxical. For those who know me well or have listened to the show, you might remember that I've been a vegetarian, or probably more accurately, a pescatarian for nearly 30 years. So this whole topic was pretty close to my heart. In this episode, we discuss what functional medicine means, some of the key markers of the inflammation spectrum for which you can easily test, and the key principles of Ketotarian-ism. And we've been talking for a long time about which ideas or terms we should turn into L200 swag, and I think Ketotarian is definitely up for consideration. Healing from food is very central to Dr. Cole's philosophy, so I spend a lot of time talking about that. So for all you food geeks out there, this is going to be a great episode for you. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. And now, this is How to Live to 200. So, Will, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about what functional medicine is and what makes it different than integrative medicine.
So functional medicine, in a nutshell, is evidence-based alternative medicine, where it really brings together the best of conventional medicine, which is being evidence-based and looking at labs, and the best of alternative health, which is actually getting somebody healthy and not just covering symptoms up with pharmaceutical drugs. So it's a way for us to get to the root cause in an objective way. And in functional medicine, we run more comprehensive labs to get to the root cause. So we're using the advancements of science and technology as far as labs are concerned to get to the root cause, which is what the goal of alternative medicine was always about anyways. So it's really this great marrying of both ways of dealing with healthcare. So that's what functional medicine is. And I've been honored and, humbled over the years to be a part of people's journey all around the world. We predominantly have a virtual functional medicine practice where we do webcam consults. And that's a way, that was unheard of even just a few years ago. And the fact that we can do telehealth or telemedicine, as they call it, is really exciting. And functional medicine is also leading the way as far as using technology to reach people, to get people access to this exciting field of healthcare all around the world.
What you mentioned comprehensive or more comprehensive tests. What are some of the tests that you would do for a normal patient coming to see you?
Well, a typical lab and a standard model of care is largely concerned with diagnosing a disease and matching it with a medication. So they want to look for, blood pressure issues. They're going to give blood pressure medication, cholesterol. You're going to get a statin drug, diabetes, and so on and so forth. It's this medicinal matching game. And what we realize in functional medicine is that, nobody's sick from a pharmaceutical deficiency. They're not going to medicate themselves into health one day. So in functional medicine, I'm less concerned with the ICD-10 code, the diagnosis code, so I can give them the appropriate medication. But what's actually driving that? So we look at the more comprehensive underlying root facet to their physiology. So things like microbiome deficiencies, like underlying gut problems or mitochondrial problems or inflammatory issues or hormonal imbalances, more comprehensively looking at hormones, nutrient deficiencies, so on and so forth, that won't change the medication. It's superfluous from a conventional medicine standpoint because the end result's still going to be that pharmaceutical drug. But from a functional medicine standpoint, what's actually driving the symptoms or the disease process to even warrant them wanting to give the medication in the first place? So that's my primary agenda from a functional medicine standpoint.
You mentioned microbiome testing, inflammation, or mitochondrial issues. What are the actual tests that someone does to understand those categories?
There's a myriad of different labs that one could run. So I think the question for a functional medicine setting is to do a comprehensive health history. Let's start there. Ask a lot of questions and actually find out what labs are the most relevant for the individual. Because we want to be comprehensive, but we don't want to be excessive with labs, just for, run the labs for the sake of it. What are the labs that are most likely going to give us information that we need to address these issues? What's actually going to change what we do for the patient? So things like microbiome issues, for example, if there's stool tests, typically there's a blood test that can tell us some things about the immune system and the microbiome as well. And urine, saliva tests can give us some other information about other things about the body, like hormones and inflammation markers. And then blood tests, obviously, I would say, is a larger part of all of that to look at the full breadth of someone's physiology.
What are the things that someone looks for when they're suffering, or your perception around inflammation?
Yeah, inflammation is really the commonality between just about every health problem out there. So typically it's easy for people to think of inflammation of, if someone banged their elbow and it's swollen, or they have an achy joint, that they get that. It's inflammatory. But what people don't realize is that inflammation can be a lot more insidious and low grade, and it's associated with even things that seemingly are unrelated to inflammation, like anxiety and depression and fatigue and brain fog. These are shown in the literature to be a pro-inflammatory state. There's a field of healthcare called the cytokine model of cognitive function, basically how inflammation impacts how our brain works. But then you look at things like autoimmune conditions. I mean, they're all, without exception, are inflammatory problems. And then things like digestive problems as well. And then the hallmarks, like the classic examples of heart disease and diabetes and cancer. These are all inflammatory. So it's really, inflammation exists on a continuum. It's the inflammation spectrum, which is what I talk a lot about. That on one end, it's the mild symptoms that people maybe settle for or push through, all the way to when it fits the criteria for us to label it with the diagnosis code and the standard of medicine. Those disease processes didn't happen overnight. So it's my goal on a functional medicine perspective to find out, wherever you're at on this inflammation spectrum, what can we do to start moving in the direction of wellness?
What would be 2 or 3 markers in which particular kind of test which would indicate somebody on the beginning of that inflammation continuum?
I would say the most common ones, and anybody's doctor can have these run, would be high sensitivity C-reactive protein, or HSCRP. And the functional range, what we want it for optimal wellness, is under 1 for that. The other one would be homocysteine. Homocysteine is an inflammatory marker. It's an amino acid that is pro-inflammatory. And the goal is to have it under 7. And typically the reference range for those is going to vary from lab to lab, which is another difference between functional medicine and conventional. We're not just looking at the statistical average of people who go to labs, which is what predominantly makes up that reference range on the lab, but we look at optimal health. So if you take people with health problems out of that reference range, that's the functional range, the optimal range. So for things, for example, for CRP, the inflammatory marker, or homocysteine, we're not just looking at the lab's reference range, we're looking at optimal health. And then another simple inflammation lab would be ferritin. We don't want it to spike too high. It's a biomarker to gauge stored iron, but high levels of it, it's considered an acute phase reactant. So basically in states of inflammation, ferritin can spike as well. So those are 3 very basic labs, and you can get more in depth and run some other functional medicine labs as well, but that's a good general viewpoint of inflammation in the body.
Are those 3 markers blood markers, urine markers, or other?
Those are all blood markers.
And would they be in a normal sort of blood panel?
Yeah, definitely. They're all on, if someone went to LabCorp or Quest and got just a typical conventional lab, we obviously run them for our patients, but anybody's doctor, you can just ask for the labs, and they have to be okay with running them. But normally they're just so basic labs that they're okay with adding that test to whatever other tests they're looking at.
Let's talk about 2 different types of patients maybe you see. One is going to be a quote unquote sick patient. Another one might be already in good health, but looking for optimal health. So performance orientation. What would be sort of a common person who's going to struggle with normal medicine that's going to ultimately come and find you? What would be the most common kinds of conditions they'd be complaining about?
For somebody that already has a health problem?
Let's talk about somebody who's, let's call it in quotes, sick, who comes to find you. And then I'll talk about a second type of patient who might already consider themselves well, but just looking for optimal.
Sure. So my top patient base would fall under the umbrella of this autoimmune inflammation spectrum. Most of them were told they have an autoimmune disease, and there's over 100 different autoimmune diseases. So that's a lot of different things of, manifesting of autoimmunity. But then there's an additional 40 above that 100 that at least have an autoimmune component. So these are things like MS and Parkinson's and ulcerative colitis and Hashimoto's thyroid problems, or the list goes on and on. Autoimmunity, the commonality there is the immune system is attacking certain parts of the body with inflammation. It's driving these pro-inflammatory cells and destroying tissue. So that is my top patient base. Now that can manifest as symptoms of neurological symptoms, digestive symptoms, hormonal symptoms, muscle joint symptoms. But that's really the commonality of most of the people that I talk to. And even if they're not full on diagnosed yet, now the criteria for diagnosis for autoimmunity are really end stage problems. Like, for example, there has to be 90% destruction of the adrenal glands before it fits the criteria in mainstream medicine to call it Addison's disease. That didn't happen overnight. And similar numbers for MS and celiac disease, there has to be significant destruction of certain parts of the body before it fits mainstream medicine's criteria to call it what it is, to call it a disease and label it with a diagnosis code. On average, it's about 10 years prior to the diagnosis when these things start brewing. So back to that inflammation spectrum concept, that many people find themselves in a state of autoimmune reactivity, meaning they're not necessarily diagnosable, but they're told by their doctor, hey, this looks autoimmune, quote unquote, or it looks like you'll get lupus, but basically wait till your body's destroyed enough of itself to then come back to us so we can give you an immunosuppressant or a steroid or something like that. So that's the people that I spend my time with. Those are the people that I spend my week dealing with these facets and starting to move their health in a better direction.
Let's just take somebody who is one of these celiac sufferers. What would be the most common sort of changes you would make in their lifestyle, their diet, or otherwise? And I certainly recognize that every patient is unique and different. But as you look across a broader spectrum, what would you normally see and what would you change?
Definitely, to your point, I think that everybody is different. And what I've found in functional medicine over the years is that even healthy things, what works for one person may not be right for the next person. But there are some commonalities I think you can look at in general. We have to start with food. Food is primary with a lot of these autoimmune conditions or any chronic health problem. You have to start with food. So it's specific for celiac, obviously, is going gluten-free. But beyond that, how do we not just avoid foods that irritate the immune system, which is certainly important, but how do we actually use food therapeutically to heal and to nourish the body? So it's not just about what we're not eating, but what we should be eating and using food as medicine in that way. So it's cleaning up their diet. It's looking at their labs and using food therapeutically to get them the nutrients they're lacking or to use foods to bring about balance where there's a lack of it. So we start with that. And then we bring in natural medicine changes as well, like herbal protocols, more advanced, like antimicrobial protocols. Sometimes if people have underlying gut dysbiosis or things like SIBO or histamine intolerance that can drive more autoimmune reactivity in the body. So those are some things that we take into consideration, but we're always basing it on these labs and as our baseline to say, okay, how do we start improving these labs? We have our baseline, but now we have work to do. The labs are really just the beginning, and then we have to start leaning into these findings to start seeing changes in someone's life.
So it's pretty common. I want to just go down this GF/celiac road for just a minute. So it'd be pretty common of what to remove from your diet, but what would be the things that would be most commonly added to your diet, as you just mentioned, if you're celiac?
Yeah, to use celiac or any, and let's just talk about autoimmune gut problems or the spectrum of that. I mean, starts with things like IBS or like gluten sensitivity or like acid reflux on one end to all the way to ulcerative colitis and Crohn's or celiac disease, these full-blown disease processes. We typically, for those cases, start on quite a soft, gentle protocol. We do lots of soups and souping and brothing and different gentle fasting protocols to really give the gut a break and the immune system to break, to start down-regulating these inflammatory cascades and start improving gut lining integrity. So that's the typical approach that you would use for someone like that. And obviously intertwining different natural medicine, herbal protocols as well. And that's just on a food level. You have to look at other components that can be driving chronic autoimmune reactivities, things like viral infections, things like food sensitivities, things like biotoxins like mold can definitely trigger the genetic predisposition for autoimmunity. So we don't want to only look at just the reactivity, but also what's driving the reactivity, which there are many things that can trigger autoimmune conditions in the body. So in reality, something like celiac, to use that example, even though it is an inflammatory gut problem or there's something going on with the digestive system, what actually triggered that in the first place? So in functional medicine, we refer to that as upstream. We're going upstream to see, is it maybe an active viral infection? Things like Epstein-Barr virus can be active for these people that have genetic predispositions for autoimmunity. And this chronic viral infection is triggering this autoimmune response in the body. So yes, deal with the gut, improve the gut health, but also is there a chronic infection that's fueling that reaction? So these are some of the things that I have to look at. That's not relevant for everybody. It's certainly, I don't want to be myopic and say, well, it's this for everybody. But you have to keep an open mind to say what could be going on here for this individual.
Is there anything that's sort of surprising from a diet or supplement perspective that you often recommend? Meaning people say, interesting, that I wouldn't have thought would be an additive food component. And we may stay in this autoimmune or more specifically on the celiac. And again, I'm just using that as one example to get very sort of tactical.
As far as food is concerned?
Yeah, something that you'd say, there's the obvious sort of nature of eating a well-balanced diet, et cetera, but there may be certain foods that you say, for a celiac sufferer, I almost always recommend adding A and B, and they generally improve using A and B, whether it be a food and or a supplement.
Yeah, so something that's maybe less known that I find good success with a lot of people is something called galangal broth. Galangal is, for people that don't know, it's basically a relative to ginger, which people know ginger tend to be very soothing to the microbiome. But we found over the years that galangal broth or cooking soups with galangal broth can be quite soothing, and it's a good plant-based gut soother. And obviously bone broth, is most people are aware of that. But a mixture of these bases for soups and stews can be very therapeutic for these people with these underlying gut problems.
Yeah, let's keep going on the diet, because I know something that's very interesting about you is your big focus on plant-based keto. And keto is certainly a big topic now, and certainly the performance category. And I'd love for you to expand on the value of a keto-based diet, and then more specifically, how do you achieve that in a plant-based way?
Yeah, so that maybe is another peculiar thing that not many people think about when it comes to autoimmunity or inflammation levels, is the fact that we can all tap into ketosis to allow your body to lower inflammation. So that's maybe unusual, because most people think of the ketogenic diet as this way to lose weight, which it certainly is, but it's so much more than that. And what excites me way more than the weight loss, which is, I don't want to delegitimize that for people that's a goal for them. But what excites me the most is the anti-inflammatory benefits of ketosis. So beta hydroxybutyrate, the main ketone that our body produces in ketosis, is not just fuel from our metabolism, but it's also known as what's called an epigenetic modulator. Basically, it does really cool things for our body. And one of them is working on these pro-inflammatory pathways, like the NF-kappa P pathway, the COX-2 pathway, these different inflammasomes. So basically, these pro-inflammatory cytokine cells and pathways, the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate downregulates and calms them and upregulates these pro-antioxidant, these pro-healing pathways like the AMPK pathway, the NRF2 pathways. So that is a tool that I use. It's not so much a food, but it's a way of using food to leverage the anti-inflammatory benefits that your body has, that all of our body has. But the problem that I have with the conventional ketogenic diet, especially for people with autoimmunity, and just the everyday person that wants to calm inflammation levels down, is that for long-term wellness, we're not talking about the short-term fad diet way to lose weight, is that depending a lot on meat, on dairy, for long-term wellness, what does that look like for the average person? Or what does it do to the microbiome, our gut bacteria long-term? And that's why I put together Ketotarian. It's, my play on words of this amalgamation between the best of being plant-based and the best of being keto. But it's a way for us to leverage the benefits of ketosis, which is exciting. It helps the brain neurologically. It helps our metabolism. It lowers inflammation. But let's do it in a clean way. So with Ketotarian, it's entirely plant-based, or at least mostly plant-based way to go keto. And on the flip side, we know the benefits of being plant-based as far as the polyphenols, the antioxidants, the fiber for our microbiome. But let's not do plant-based in a way that is, a carbitarian is what I call it in the book. Just basically depend on grains and sugar for fuel. Let's be fat adapted and be plant-based at the same time.
And what inspired you to write this book? Let's remind everybody of the title and maybe the summary, and then what got you to wanting to write this book.
So Ketotarian is really born out of my own personal journey. I was a traditional vegan for 10 years, from my mid to late teens to my mid to late 20s. And I was eating real food, just like most of my patients are by the time they meet me. They're eating clean, but they're still struggling with health issues. So we're looking, where do we go from here? We have to do something different to see different results. And that's when my own personal journey evolved from being a vegan conventionally to Ketotarian, this sort of plant-centric, but being fat adapted and having metabolic flexibility and not always being bound by being in sugar burning mode, which most people in the West find themselves in. It's like kindling on a fire. You can put kindling on, it'll create light and energy, but it's short-lived. And you can have the dirty kindling of the standard American diet to the cleaner kindling of real foods and healthy stuff that still break down into sugar. But I wanted to feel better. I wanted to feel my best. And that's when I gained metabolic flexibility that I teach about in the book in Ketotarian, so people can do it for themselves. And it's something that also coincided with my clinical experience in functional medicine and seeing what works and what doesn't for people, and getting as much as I could get in a book in Ketotarian, so people can start implementing these functional medicine tools in their own life. So half of the book is, science and practical health tips and how to be plant-based keto. And then the other half of the book is recipes and pretty pictures and meal plans and all of that stuff too. So it's vegan keto, vegetarian keto, and then pescatarian keto, or what I call in the book a vegetarian. Still plant-centric, but having wild-caught fish and fresh seafood and things like that. So people can really, again, do keto in a clean way was my objective, but talk about all this other functional medicine, geeky stuff of like running inflammation labs and getting a benchmark from this standpoint to start using food to feel great, yes, but also using food as medicine to improve these markers that we've talked about on the show so far.
Does your advice vary significantly for people of different age? So my daughter's 19 versus myself, 52. Does it vary men to women?
It can, definitely. I think it depends on age. It depends on activity level. It can depend on gender as well. So it's about going back to functional medicine. What works for one person may not be right for the next person. So the template of being plant-based or mostly plant-based keto or ketotarian, as I talk about in the books, I recommend it to do this way of eating for 8 weeks. That allows your body to create metabolic flexibility, to burn fat for fuel and not just kindling on the fire. We're going to put a log on the fire, or burning fat for fuel. But from that standpoint, to answer your question, I think that things that you can adjust towards age and gender or even personal preference are things like cyclical ketotarian, where you can be in ketosis maybe 4 to 5 days a week, and then you moderate your healthy carbs the other remaining days out of the week. And a lot of women like to do this around their cycle, or some men like to do this around workouts. So you can do that. Some people like to do ketotarian seasonally. So during the winter months, they may be in more ketosis, and then in the summer, they're having more fresh fruits and seasonal farmers market sort of stuff. And that's from an ancestral health standpoint, what many people's ancestors would have done as well. So there's definitely ways for you, no matter based on age or gender or activity level, you really can take this template of being fat adapted in a plant-centric way, but let's make it work for your life. And some people just like eating more fruits and carbs and things like that, and that's fine. And you can cycle in and out of ketosis, but you've built that metabolic flexibility during those initial 8 weeks.
Any different advice for somebody who's pregnant or trying to conceive?
No, the foods we're focusing on in Ketotarian are very nutrient dense. They're some of the world's most nutrient dense foods on the planet. From a metabolic standpoint, my general advice from a functional medicine standpoint is to, if you're not fat adapted when you're during your pregnancy, let's just say you're pregnant and then you say, I want to go keto and I want to go and become a fat burner. I would recommend starting and using the foods in Ketotarian, nourish your growing baby with these nutrient-dense healing foods, healthy fats, which are needed for healthy brain development and healthy immune system, all this great stuff. But I would say for the average person, there's exceptions to this rule, to not be so concerned with being in ketosis at that time, only because you're going to be making that metabolic transition when it's not really needed. Now, if someone's fat adapted already, it's completely fine to stay being fat adapted. Again, this is working on really healthy food. Your body's burning ketones. It's a healthy thing. And every baby is born with using ketones for fuel. Every baby gets through breast milk, it actually produces ketones on their own. Little baby does, for brain development and optimal neurological health. And even if they weren't breastfed, what is added to the formula? It's MCT oil. From fats from coconut and palm oil. So this is something that is quite in alignment for healthy babies, healthy pregnancy. But I don't recommend people, shifting and doing anything dramatic, especially if they're eating the standard American diet, to necessarily go and say, I'm going to shift my metabolism to being a fat burner if they're 3 months pregnant. So I think context is important and timing is important. But as a general rule of using food as medicine, this is a fantastic way for people to eat.
How do most of your patients measure their states of ketosis?
Well, I like to keep things simple typically, and that's why I wanted to keep it simple in the book and just go off of how you feel. I don't like to be super biohackerish. I know like some people are really into that. I'm not really into it. I just like to use food and as medicine, feel good, enjoy the food that I'm eating. So I have increased energy. I can go longer without eating food. I can intermittent fast just randomly because I'm not hangry. I'm fat adapted. So go off of how you feel, and that's one way to do it. But obviously, from a diagnostician standpoint, from a functional medicine standpoint, and certainly if you're using the ketogenic diet to manage health problems, you don't necessarily have the luxury that I have. So like for my patients that we're trying to monitor things and get the benefits of ketosis and be specific about certain levels of ketones, we have to measure ketones. So there's a time and place for it, certainly. But the gold standard for that is blood ketone meter. You're measuring beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood, similar to a glucometer or blood sugar meter. The second one would be breath. That's measuring breath acetone, which is shown in some studies to be directly proportional to beta hydroxybutyrate. So it's a way to gauge ketosis. You just breathe into a meter. When I do measure, I use the breath meter typically. And then the third way, which is not recommended, especially long-term, would be urine strips. But those are not beneficial or accurate, specifically for long-term ketosis, because all it's really telling you is that you're good at peeing out ketones, which isn't the goal. It's just showing you kind of if there's a presence of ketones, but you want to be burning ketones, not urinating them out.
Do you have a specific recommendation for either one of those two, either the blood or breath meters?
The blood is gold standard. So as far as the science and the data and the reproducibility, you have to go with blood. But I am excited about the emerging science around the breath ketones. I prefer it because I don't have to prick my finger. I like the fact that I don't have to buy strips. I just paid for the the breath meter, and then it's like just a one purchase, and you don't have to keep buying the strips. So I like the simplicity of the breath meter. We've had great success with it clinically too. So gold standard, but some exciting science and pretty accurate too.
Do you have a specific breath meter that you recommend?
Yes, the brand is Ketonix. I don't have any, affiliation with them other than they're like kind of the leading company in that field.
In the last year's period of time, based on all this research and writing you've done, what's been the major changes you've had on both your diet and or lifestyle?
I think for me, lately at least, I've been really leaning into different fasting protocols, which I talk about in Ketotarian. But I'm fascinated about the field of autophagy or cellular repair as far as making, supporting anti-aging mechanisms, anti-disease mechanisms, and the fact that ketosis enhances autophagy, intermittent fasting enhances autophagy and ketosis, and being plant-based enhances autophagy. So I'm excited to really, obviously we bring all of those together in Ketotarian, but the fact that people can now, in my own life, I've been doing it, and I'm excited about how I feel and my labs and all this great stuff. But what I'm actually most excited about right now is that people that aren't even my patients, right? They're just reading the book. They're messaging us on social media, and they're telling us their own personal health stories about how their labs are improving, how they feel better, all this stuff that I have never, as a doctor, have never been able to gauge on that level and just hear people's own personal experience with something that you've tried in your own life, you've seen with patients, but you've been managing it yourself. And these are people that I'm not managing it at all. They're just taking this information and using it for themselves.
What has been your fasting protocol?
Depends on the day. So typically throughout the work week, I do a 12 to 6 window. So I'll eat between 12 p.m. and 6 p.m. So it's just a nice time restricted feeding. And I fast between 6 p.m. to the following day at noon. And I will typically fast with only water, and I drink Earl Grey tea because Earl Grey tea has bergamot in it, which bergamot is a citrus from Calabria and Italy, and it's been shown to enhance autophagy as well. So again, marrying the benefits of things that enhance autophagy or cellular repair with Earl Grey tea. And then I'll break the fast at lunch and have a Ketotarian lunch and a Ketotarian dinner and get my calories in that window between 12 and 6. When I travel frequently for work and speaking in different cities. So I'll typically do an OMAD or OMAD, one meal a day, sort of fasting when I'm flying. So I avoid all of the airport food. And even though I'm excited about the growing amount of healthy options at airports, I have to give airports kudos on that. But I typically will fast for the day and just get my calories in that 1 hour ratio. So it's a 23-to-1 fasting to eating ratio with the OMAD. So those are two different fasts that I do depending on if I'm seeing patients in my clinic or if I'm traveling.
What books or podcasts do you listen to that you recommend to your patients the most often?
Books besides Ketotarian, I love, this is completely not health related at all, but I love Eckhart Tolle's books. I love The Power of Now and New Earth. I think those are just fundamental readings that you can really, they're practical tips to help with present moment awareness and mindfulness, which let me just bring this into food. And something, a concept that I weaved through Ketotarian is the fact that present moment awareness, inner body awareness will allow you to make more healthy choices. Because if you are consciously eating or consciously aware of what your body needs, you're more apt to eat healthy foods. So that's something that I definitely brought my own interest in Eckhart Tolle's work into Ketotarian, because I really feel it makes for sustainable wellness choices with food and movement. So Eckhart Tolle's books for sure. Podcast, this doesn't have to do with health per se. What do I listen to? You know what? So much. I don't listen to podcasts that often. And the podcasts I listen to are completely not health related. I think I just need like the dichotomy in my life. They're normally like history podcasts, and I don't tell my patients to listen to them at all. But if you're going back to what I tell patients to do is to get like meditation apps. They're not podcasts, but things like Headspace and Calm, and start implementing these acts of stillness in their life. So that's what I tell patients to do.
You mentioned meditation as an important component. What effects do you see when people start using applications like Calm or Headspace?
They make more acts of wellness. I think that radiant wellness flows from present moment awareness, and I think sustainable wellness certainly, because there's only so long you can do 4 weeks of this or 8 weeks of this without really getting your head and your heart right. And really, a concept that I talk about in Ketotarian is you cannot heal a body you hate. And I see a lot of people in this reactive mind mode of just so used to punishing their body with another diet. It's really the antithesis of Ketotarian. So what I really what I see in my patients' lives is that they're more apt to make healthy choices in the food that they eat because they are centered with themselves. So that's one thing that I see. But also, when there's a grace and a lightness to your life, even removing food from that, if you just have a lightness to life, even when things don't go your way, you have a grace and lightness permeating throughout your life. I see labs improve a lot faster compared to the people that are constantly in this state of stress and anxiety and worry and regret or anger. All this stuff has been shown in the literature to drive inflammation, impact our hormones, all this negative stuff. So I think it's conducive to wellness to really be anchored in the present moment as much as you can be.
So we've talked about diet and stress and meditation. What changes do you see, or what recommendations do you have for people on a sleep category?
One thing that we do recommend is to turn off technology a couple hours before bed, or if you're not going to, wear blue light blocking glasses when the sun goes down to start to activating melatonin levels to get proper sleep at night, because sleep is paramount. Sleep is not a luxury for the people that are not busy. It is a necessity for our wellness. And many people think it's something, well, they're busy and this is something they just are never going to have good sleep. But the reality is it's paramount. Just one night of poor sleep has been shown to drive inflammation levels up, let alone years and years and years of poor sleep, which is what most people find themselves with.
Okay, now I'm going to read off a bunch of different sort of treatments or therapies, and I'd love for you to answer on, I use that regularly, I've tried it, I have no interest in that at all, I've never heard of it, or I think it's total bullshit.
Okay.
All right, gutter microbiome testing.
It's great.
Performance blood testing by a company maybe like Inside Tracker.
I've never heard of it.
IPS cell banking.
I've never heard of it.
Intermittent fasting.
I love it.
Longer fasts, greater than 3 days.
Depends on the person.
Quantifying sleep with something like an Oura Ring or another application.
I think it's a great idea if it doesn't stress you out.
NAD.
I think it's a great idea. I use it.
Telomere testing or lengthening.
It's interesting, but I think the jury is a bit out on the application for that.
Hyperbaric oxygen training.
I think it can be great.
EMS exercise.
I think it can be great.
PRP in rehabilitation and/or cosmetics.
Yeah, I think it can be a great application.
Nootropics.
I think it could be a great application.
Modafinil.
I'm not aware of it.
Okay. Nicotine as an additive.
I'm not a fan of that.
Heavy metal testing.
Depends on the test and how you're preparing it. Most heavy metals are stored in fat, so I would use some sort of chelation to get a proper amount. This isn't rapid fire.
If you could live 20% better or 20% longer, which would you choose?
20% better.
Great. Will, thank you so much for joining us on the show today and sharing all your great information.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to another episode of How to Live to 200. Thank you so much for joining me and exploring this world together. I get a ton of help from the L200 crew that includes Lauren Krayinsky and Kevin Kirkpatrick. The theme music is composed by Emmett McCann. Yes, that's my nephew. You can learn more about this and other episodes at our website, livingto200.com, or find us on Twitter or Instagram at howtolivето200, where we post lots of photos of cool things. It's early days for this podcast, so we would appreciate any and all comments or telling a friend or two about what we're doing over here. It might be irresponsible for you to keep it a secret. Until next time, eat right, get lots of sleep, keep good numbers, and be looking around the corner for the next big breakthrough. If we're going to live a long time, we better do it well.